Chapter 20. A New Hope. You are listening at novelfull.audio. There was a common trait found in most intelligent people. A lot of thinking, little action. Blessed are the simple-minded was not a saying that just happened to exist. There was obviously a basis for this claim. People who were a little bit dumber than average, or sometimes just men of action, were naturally less concerned about the implications behind their actions. They did not ask themselves the question, am I wasting my time, or how many others have failed before me? They were content to take action, letting themselves be carried along by the flow. The procrastinators were all, without exception, great thinkers. It took a minimum of intelligence to constantly question the meaning of one's objectives, to put them into perspective and then to ignore them. Most of them were lunatics, planning complex plans to achieve their goals, often also quite perfectionist. Yet, when the time came to take action for good, these people deflated, finding all sorts of excuses. There were two simple reasons for this. The fear of failure, which was logically proportional to the immensity of the task at hand, and the feeling of futility, which could be summed up by the question, what's the point? Jake was suffering from the second case. If you fed your imagination of invincible superheroes, completely overpowered protagonists becoming stronger and faster by applying simple precepts like no pain no gain, you were doomed to despair. Add to that an outlet in the form of video games and free web novels and you ended up with someone like Jake. A person that nothing could motivate, because after all, it wasn't worth it. I thought that if there was a path, it meant that the rewards were earned for good. Why did my stats drop after a simple day of rest? Jake complained like a cranky kid whose lollipop had just been snatched. Are you serious? She growled with undisguised disdain. Could you tell me in detail the recipe for the first stew the path made you cook? Jake gasped, realizing the uncertainty he'd chosen to ignore all along was now being thrown back in his face. How could I? It's been 3 weeks, I've been cooking non-stop, cramming all kinds of boring stuff, without ever once having a moment for myself. Of course, I forgot. I vaguely remember a few steps, like chopping onions or meat, but most stews tend to look the same anyway. The proportions of spices, the exact sequence, I have no idea. As you said, you have forgotten. You're only human after all. She reminded him in a sympathetic voice. Naturally, this is reflected in your statistics. Or maybe you were hoping the oracle would take pity on you and inflate your levels of knowledge to clear your conscience. Jake sensed a headache coming. For fuck's sake, he had an IQ over 140, not 40. Of course, he had thought about that. But what was he supposed to do about it? Give up even before he started? He could be stupid sometimes, but he wasn't so senile yet that he forgot the world was going to hell. Is it possible to at least retain what I've learned? Not wasting weeks of effort in a matter of days. Jake wondered aloud. Sure, it can be done. You forget because your brain's memory capacity is limited, as is your attention span. She explained in a bored tone. A glimmer of hope lit up Jake's eyes. Thank you, Sherlock. Then how many points of intelligence would I need to not forget anything? That's a harder question than it sounds. The intelligence shown on your status is calculated by including many cognitive functions. Memory is only one of those variables. The formula is not that simple. If the amount of information you can retain doubles, your intelligence can double as well in practice, if your thinking ability follows. However, if your reaction speed doubles, your intelligence won't necessarily double in this case. Take the example of a cat. No matter how long it tries to capture the red light of a laser, it will never understand that the light source comes from somewhere else. A faster brain wouldn't make any difference. That's a fundamental limitation. A better memory, on the other hand, might help him realize that something is wrong. Or at least, if it does, the cat will remember it. Please, just give me a number. Jake begged, vainly hoping to be spared from another lecture. If I consider that your brain is evolving uniformly, I'd say at least 200 points. You'll still forget over time because the brain has limited storage capacity, but it will be negligible. Jake was stunned. 200 points meant so much intelligence that the world's greatest geniuses would look like a bunch of retards. That equated to an IQ of 2000. Considering his cognitive faculties were in balance, it was terrifying. His memory would be 20 times better by default, but so would his concentration and understanding. In reality, this would translate into a much higher learning capacity than that number. Fuck, is that even possible? Checking for paths to become invincible or dominate the universe, that was the first thing I did. And the answer? Nothing, nada, neat. Jake became enraged by this underhanded move from she. Authority insufficient, she responded with the same casual tone. But to his surprise, it was that hated response that calmed Jake. He had just become aware of an absurdity in the oracle's workings. When I make irrational wishes like developing superhuman intelligence, no path is generated. Instead, if I ask she sends me back to my insufficient level of authority. Where's the catch? That was the crux of the matter. He'd already seen first-hand that the oracle wasn't infallible. There was at least one wild mouse laughing in its face. So, was the absence of paths really a sign that it was impossible? Not necessarily. There was still the possibility that the paths were not presented to him, as they were considered impossible or fatal. The paths I am thinking of, do they exist or am I wasting my time? He asked one last time, just to confirm it once and for all. Raise the rank of your oracle, and I might be able to give you some answers. But remember that sometimes ignorance is a bliss. She had literally just admitted that he wasn't just deluding himself so he could regain some semblance of hope. The depression that had gripped Jake that day, and was on the verge of making him fall back into his old vices, was gone. He now had only one goal. To raise the damn experience gauge to 100% in order to increase his rank, which was still 0, to rank 1. Only then could he start planning his future. So his first good idea was to get back to work. Jake had long noticed that the oracle was rewarding him with a fraction of the experience needed each time he reached a milestone in the pursuit of his paths. The only downside was that reaching the next rank required finishing almost all the paths in progress. Going to the end of the path based on physical training could not be done in less than 6 months. If he decided to cram all day long, he could probably learn the rest of the books on the list in a few weeks. Unfortunately, 40 plus 30% was only 70%. With the 5% he earned from having fun with Ruby, he was still 25% short. The only missions he had left out so far were those that were aimed at correcting his social skills and improving his charisma. Not because they were long or painful, but precisely because they forced him to make a type of effort that he found a million times more awful than training in the gym. Nevertheless, the facts spoke for themselves. Jake could get the 30% in just a few days, provided he was willing to push back the limits of his embarrassment. Therefore, he decided, it was finally time to go to that bloody hairdresser. It would be the first step to build the image of his brand new self. These 3 weeks of drastic training had at least the merit of completely changing his morphology. He hadn't lost much weight on the scale, but the fat had given way to muscles. Many might have thought of doping at the beginning of the 21st century, but with the technology of the 2100s, it wasn't so shocking. It was still unbelievable though. His mane of hair was longer and more tangled than ever, but at least physically, he now had a certain bearing. His skin was much clearer, his eyes were brighter, and his body was well defined without looking massive. To be honest, he had never looked better. Oh, and there was one last detail. Jake was rich now. Instead of getting his money back after 3 days, as the path had recommended at first, he had instead taken the trouble to be patient and let his money grow. The result was what he had hoped for. The impact of a warp drive engine was far more impressive than he originally imagined. Investors all wanted a piece of the pie, and his stock price hit the roof in an instant. With his depressive episode over, Jake realized for the first time that he was a millionaire and a handsome young man with a bright future ahead of him. Chapter 21 Meet an Acquaintance. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The sun was at its zenith, the afternoon having just begun. Jake may have wasted his morning wallowing, but now that he was on the right track, there was no turning back. He packed his gym clothes and sneakers, didn't forget to take his credit card and some cash, and went to the fitness center while doing his usual jog. His physical metamorphosis was palpable. The few kilometers he struggled to complete without spitting out his lungs were as grueling as ever, but it took him much less time to get to his fitness center. He also sweated much less and caught his breath more quickly. Jake was gradually becoming aware of the sidelong glances he was getting. New gym members saw him as a regular, while the regulars were amazed to find that his headless training had paid off. A few chicks that came to the gym to maintain their precious bodies were giving him teasing glances. Still as introverted as ever, he chose to look right through them, going straight to the barber shop. The latter was just one of a long list of stores that had found in this sports center an occasion to make a profit. Perfume shop, pharmacy, health food or clothing stores, no space was wasted. The shop window seen from the outside was somewhat standard, with photos of models with unlikely haircuts and some posters or display products to please the sponsors. Jake strode into the hair salon with a resolute look on his face. He was still sweating a little, but clearly the coach had not advised him to take a shower, so why bother? If it didn't earn him experience points, it probably wouldn't have any decisive impact whether he was clean or not. And indeed, it turned out to be irrelevant. Once inside, the hairdressing salon turned out to be rather spacious and well lit. The equipment looked new, the leather armchairs and worktops were impeccable as well. There was only a couch and a few magazines to wait, though the salon turned out to be empty. Two middle-aged hairdressers were enjoying their moment of respite, chatting over a cup of coffee. These women had emaciated faces, clearly affected by the recent upheavals brought about by the alien ship. Some, like Jake, saw the arrival of the oracles as a blessing, while for others the bracelets only meant misfortune and misery. Their society had been turned upside down by these devices, revolutionizing their lifestyles. They had lost customers, the most demanding of them going directly to the professionals the oracle considered more competent. Including those who were terrified and confined within their own homes, these hairdressers had seen their salaries cut by more than half. When they heard the front door squeak, revealing a handsome young man with enough hair to give free rein to their creativity, they were all too ready to give it a go. Their greedy eyes sparkled with joy, like a hungry predator before a fat prey. Their first big catch since the beginning of the week. Jake, unaware of the excitement his arrival had just triggered, said a shy hello before sitting on the couch to await his turn. The youngest hairdresser, though not quite so fresh either, came up to him with a welcoming smile. Unfortunately, her yellow teeth ruined her good intentions, testifying to her smoking habits. When you had an idea of the price of a packet of cigarettes in the 22nd century, you could immediately understand her plight. "Hello, handsome. What can I do for you?" she said in a formal tone. Even her perfume reeked. Jake loved citrus like everyone else, but when that smell occurred in a public place, it reminded him more of toilet deodorant. "Hello. Well, you only have to look at the top of my head to know why I'm here. A functional cut will do the trick. A little length at the top, tapered at the sides." Jake hated going to the hairdresser, but that was precisely why he knew exactly what to ask for. He did not give a damn about current trends, nor the hairdresser's advice. "All right, will you follow me, sir?" she said, showing him the way. She took him to another section at the back of the barber shop, which was initially out of his sight. Other armchairs leaning against special sinks were lined up next to each other, with many mirrors on the opposite wall so that you could watch yourself shamefully get off on a complete stranger shampooing your hair. To his surprise, another customer was already waiting on one of the chairs, with the characteristic blank stare of a person communicating with his Oracle AI. The hairdressers had left him in the lurch while they finished their gossip exchange. The real surprise, however, was that he recognized the person in question. It was Paul Baker, another of his company workers. Having not come to work at the virtual reality arcade center, Jake hadn't seen him for almost a month. Paul was once the seducer of their gang of nerds. From his 190 centimeters height, he was the classic handsome dark-haired man who made the ladies fall in love with him. He had a charming smile and knew how to be helpful. Given that he was also a professional VR player, he was the perfect charismatic employee. Well, that was all in the past. The Paul Baker sitting in front of him was quite different. Unlike him, who had lost his cowardly physique, Paul had lost weight in an alarming way. The once robust fellow was now almost too scrawny for his own good. His eyes were sunken in their sockets, with large bags underneath showing how sleep-deprived he was. His hands grasping the arm of the armchair were trembling slightly, evidence of an excess of caffeine. "Paul. Is that you? What's happened to you?" asked Jake, shocked to see him so weakened. The young man turned his head towards him when he heard his voice, his eyes flashing suddenly. As he contemplated his former colleague's new appearance, he couldn't help but breathe a long sigh. "Hi, Jake. As you can see, I've had better days. I'm glad to see that things seem to be going well for you. I want you to know that our meeting here today is no accident. It was my oracle that led me here. Of course, I also needed to freshen up my hair, so I might as well kill two birds with one stone." Jake was well aware that he could be included in someone else's predictions. Still, it was confusing to be part of Paul's path. They may have been company workers in the past, but they had never been friends. As a self-respecting introverted nerd, he was running away like the plague from this kind of radiant individual. Apart from Harry, who was like him, and Camille, who was a hottie and his direct supervisor, he truly didn't give a damn about anyone else. Anyway, Jake had come in for a haircut, and he had no intention of changing his plan. So he slumped into one of the chairs to Paul's right, and could now watch his reflection in the mirror as much as he wanted. Meanwhile, the hairdressers had finished their coffee break and were ready to get to work. They put on a pair of latex gloves, pressed their heads against the sink and turned on the taps. Once the water was hot enough, they soaked the boys' hair and then brushed them with shampoo. To earn their rates, they massaged their scalps for longer than they should have, making them grunt with satisfaction. Even Paul seemed to relax. After that, the hairdressers moved them into the main workroom. Perhaps because they were relieved to have two clients at once, they showed great professionalism, showing all their expertise. Paradoxically, Paul, who was used to sophisticated and trendy cuts, asked for the same functional cut as Jake. His former colleague was like a stranger. During the entire performance, the two young men remained silent. When the hairdressers finished their task, a huge mass of hair was scattered on the tile floor and he felt as if his head was lighter. Jake then paid his hairdresser, leaving a generous tip, and left with Paul on his heels. After that, Jake continued following his path as though nothing had happened. He did his training just like the other days, replicating the gestures of his shadow guide with absolute confidence. Paul, for his part, did not stop him. The handsome former boy watched him make all those strange movements with a thoughtful look. As if he was wondering about the difference between their respective ways of coping with all these turmoil. In the end, when Jake was drenched in sweat and totally out of energy, Paul finally made up his mind. "I'm having a party at my house tonight. I'd like you to come. Harry, Thru, and even Camille will be there." He revealed his true purpose, leaving Jake dubious. Given Paul's condition, he clearly didn't look like he was in the mood. Besides, he and Harry had never been invited to any of his previous parties. What was different this time? "Sorry, mission. Party at Paul Baker's house, potential rewards. Learning about the mouse, meeting people, seducing Camille." Communication skills +1, self-confidence +1, level of authority +5%. Coaching had just decided otherwise. What is it, Jake? Something's come up. Checked Paul, slightly worried. No, everything's fine. Okay for tonight, I'll be there. With those words, they parted. This proposal was unexpected, but it had the merit of aligning with his plans. After all, what better way to improve social skills than with a party? Chapter 22. Let's get this party started. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 22. Let's get this party started. Jake brooded for a long time over the reasons behind Paul's invitation. He had always been inclined to party, but a little voice in his head was whispering to him that things would be quite different this time. Jake decided to take it easy for the rest of the afternoon. He didn't have enough time anyway to accomplish anything substantial. For the first time in several weeks, he turned on his TV. Completely obsessed with his path, he hadn't paid the slightest attention to his surroundings. He knew that the world was going badly. After all, he was ardently following this path for this very reason. Letting himself be distracted by some news, a lot of alarmist ones at that, would not have done him any good. Jake wasn't fooled, though. After the first few days when the streets were emptier than usual, they had become bustling again. However, it did not last. The alleyways were not empty, many people kept on going to work or attending to their business, but there were some details that would catch the eye of a discerning eye. Like the game Spot the Difference, the situation might look the same at first glance, but when you really compared the details, the differences were striking. First of all, the silence. The birds stopped singing, the dogs stopped barking, the crickets and the cicadas also stopped chirping. If we pushed the paranoia even further, there were almost no insects. Temperatures were still warm in early September, flies and mosquitoes should have been ruining his life. After all, he had sweet blood, or at least a smell they liked. However, this was not enough to conclude anything. It would no doubt fuel conspiracy theories, but there may have been more rational explanations that he didn't know about. But that wasn't the only strange thing. Small and large businesses were closing down one after the other. Large food stores were increasingly affected by stock shortages. It started with occasional delays in deliveries, especially of fresh fish, and then it spread to other foodstuffs. Now, meat, fish, fresh fruit and vegetables were no longer supplied on a regular basis. Prices, which were already high, soared again. If Jake hadn't suddenly become an upstart, he would have been affected by all this. The key point was the rumor that something weird was going on in the provinces outside New Paris. No one really knew what was going on there. The poorest households were protesting in the streets, complaining that their income was no longer enough to cover their food needs. At the same time, everyone who had relatives in these remote areas reported being unable to reach them. Without exception, voicemail messages were immediately received as if the smartphones were turned off or cut off from the phone network. The government was not helping at all. Military personnel had been deployed in the heart of New Paris, allegedly to stop the riots and ensure the safety of its citizens. The problem was that they also controlled the entrances and exits of the city. Well, just the entrances in fact. The highways were only congested in one direction. No one, except for a few heavily guarded transport trucks, could enter the capital. Jake had neither news of his cousin nor his uncle, but unlike most of the people involved, he was not worried that much. Indeed, it was not uncommon for them to be out of town and unreachable for weeks at a time. His cousin Anya was working for the government anyway and probably knew a lot more about the situation than he did. Even though she would be subject to professional secrecy, he was convinced that, in the event of real trouble, she would not leave him in the dark and would bring him up to date. As for his uncle Kalen, he had been radio silent since Jake had tipped him off about the various anomalies he had noticed. Asserting that he did not think about it would be a lie, but moping would be an equally noxious mistake. He had almost forgotten about the stray cat eating mouse. The memory trotted in one corner of his head, but over time it had become blurry, less frightening. The fact that he had never again encountered such rodents also had a part to play in this. On the flat screen, a report was discussing the net increase in criminal activity since the arrival of the oracles. Serial murder, and petty theft of all kinds had multiplied like a roach colony in the air ducts of an unsanitary housing project. Despite the fact that the police could easily find the culprits with the help of their oracles, many crimes were committed every day. The reason for this was obvious. The rush of adrenaline that accompanied taking a risk combined with the satisfaction of fulfilling a coach's mission. A serial killer was probably receiving all-day-long challenge missions to carry out more and more sophisticated crimes, or with increasingly strict conditions. Some paths might even allow to escape all suspicion, or have innocent people charged, regardless of the existence of the oracles to refute these false accusations. Moreover, the experience given by the oracles to increase the authority level was proportional to the difficulty of the paths achieved. Some of these fugitives still at large may have already promoted their rank to the next level. Jake turned off the television when the report advised every citizen to stay home after nightfall. It sounded dangerously like a curfew. When it was finally past 7 p.m., Jake began to get ready. He put on a simple white shirt, stretchy black pants and a pair of suede shoes, no less comfortable than his sneakers. His clothing style lacked any extravagance, remaining functional and comfortable. His idle instincts having a hard life, he made do with an old-fashioned comb. Over. He inspected himself in the mirror for a brief moment, a contented smirk on his face, before setting off on his walk. Crunch ignored him all along, taking a deep nap. The former homeless cat had gained weight and was now living his pasha life with gusto. It was the first time he had ever been to Paul's house. His parents were among the fortunate few who owned an old villa prior to the construction of New Paris. It was originally an old cottage lost in the middle of nowhere, but after the site was chosen to become the new capital, it became a popular piece of real estate. Refusing to sell, the old residence had remained the same throughout the years, sticking out like a sore thumb among all the skyscrapers in the city center. Besides being located in the heart of the business district with all amenities nearby, the police station was in the same street, ensuring optimal security. The other good thing was that it was less than 20 minutes walk away. The red sun was fading away on the horizon, giving way to night when Jake reached his destination. A high gate and an intimidating wrought iron fence isolated the house from ordinary people. Jake rang the intercom to announce himself. Seconds later, the gate opened with a shrill squeak that made his ears bleed. A little lubricant to smooth out the joints would have been nice. A short paved road and a fallow garden separated him from the mansion. As he walked those few meters, he noticed a doghouse, but no dog was nearby. As night fell, the old stone cottage looked like a haunted house. Fortunately, the atmosphere changed completely when he walked through the front door. A piece of deafening pop-electro music immediately assaulted his eardrums. Multicolored strobe lights really gave the feeling of entering a nightclub. "Hey! Jake, you came. I can't believe it." Harry, sipping his beer near the lobby, was thrilled to see him. Before his arrival, he was chatting with two other men. Paul Baker, the owner of the house, and through Abimbala, another of his co-workers. Both greeted him in turn. Paul, whom he had met earlier, only nodded his head. Through, for his part, shook his hand with a strong grip. The smell of musky spice immediately attacked his nostrils. Or in fact, it did not. Through Abimbala was a tall black man, 1.9 meters tall, obese, and his skin was constantly oily and oozing with sweat. He was the fruit of a hazardous union, an Ethiopian father and an Indian mother. He had inherited his father's skin color and his mother's straight hair. His parents ran a restaurant mixing their two cultures, which together with his poor body hygiene gave him an exotic body odor to keep it poetic. He wasn't a social nerd like them, quite the opposite. However, he had a peculiar character, manifested by a self-confidence that was absolutely disproportionate to what reality would suggest. Nevertheless, life was full of surprises. Tonight, Thru smelled good. He was well dressed, had his hair done, and had even lost 7 or 8 kilos since the last time they had seen each other. He was still obese, but it was still an incredible transformation, worthy of praise. All in all, and unlike Paul, Thru was another of those people to whom the oracle had given wings. Chapter 23 Paul's Story Part 1 You're listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 23 Paul's Story Part 1 Although Thru's physical transformation was impressive, it wasn't enough to destabilize Jake, since after all he didn't care about almost anything. However, if someone claimed that the oracle had no hand in it, he would refuse to believe it. After the reunion, the group of friends joined the rest of the guests, beginning a new series of introductions. Camille Els, his superior, was also present. A tight black evening gown had replaced her usual suit, giving her a much more sexy and comely look. Dressed like this, she looked more approachable, less haughty, as if the distance between the boss and his employees had disappeared. Besides Camille, there were about 20 people he didn't know, all of them Paul's friends or acquaintances. One only had to look at these guests to realize how they looked out of place in comparison. The girls were all gorgeous, dressed like models posing for a parade, while the men were elegant and athletic. Their trendy clothes, plus the few luxury brands he recognized, reflected their affluent social backgrounds. All these people were chatting among themselves as if they had all known each other for a while. They were probably all longtime friends of Paul's, sharing the same hobbies. The fact that Camille was invited was not a surprise in itself. She was hot after all and in the same age bracket as them. That Paul took the initiative to invite Thru, Harry and him was a real surprise, though. Before today, their relationship had been limited to work, remaining cordial at best, at worst with barely concealed contempt. Paul, present your friends to me. A tall man over 2 meters tall, with an Afro-American physique, embraced him with a friendly smile. At first, he seemed nice and enthusiastic about making new friends. However, even someone as uncommunicative as Jake could notice his fleeting glance at Camille's cleavage. Men, all the same. Jake sighed with deep contempt. You know you're a man too, she retorted in an exasperated tone. Naturally, Jake wisely chose to ignore her. Any man other than him, obviously wasn't him. Even if he was the one squinting at Camille's cleavage, it would be excusable. With this kind of wobbly mentality, he could practically justify every one of his actions and freely criticize others without ever suffering a case of conscience. The 2M Giants initiative allowed Paul to introduce them to the rest of his friends. Their interactions were polite and some banalities were exchanged. Nevertheless, one could sense in their attitude that they were wondering since when Paul had been associating with this kind of individuals. Of course, they kept their opinions to themselves. Even among the bourgeoisie of New Paris, owning a big house like this one was not so easy. There were, however, 3 people in this group who stood out for their gloomy faces. Like Paul, they were pale and emaciated, and seemed to have lost a lot of weight in a short time. The first was a young Afro-American boy with dreadlocks about 1.8 meters tall, named Kanye, who was the younger brother of the 2-meter tall giant who first approached them. The other 2 were a pair of petite-looking twins named Elisa and Sarah. They had a tan skin typical of Middle Eastern countries, but their hair was a Venetian blonde. They remained rather pretty, but their deep dark circles made them look sickly and not very reassuring. Of course, if the primary intention of the evening was indeed to have fun and get drunk, it hid another purpose. After the group had begun warming up to each other over a few drinks and appetizers, Paul Baker waved his head at Jake indicating that he should follow him to another room. Kanye, Elisa and Sarah accompanied the duo, claiming they wanted to help in the kitchen. Paul had actually planned it, putting pizzas in the oven, which gave him the perfect alibi to isolate himself for a while. Once in the kitchen, Paul closed the latch, then turned to Jake with a serious expression. "First of all, Jake, I want you to know that I know for a fact that you don't like me and that you don't care what happens to me." He began by making it clear what his true intentions were. "The reason I invited you here tonight is that I'm following a path. Now, let me tell you what I've been going through in the last month, so you can understand why the four of us are in this mess." Kanye, Sarah and Elisa all had anxious faces and were shaking slightly. It was subtle, but Jake's trained eye didn't miss this detail. What they had endured to end up in such a state was a mystery that he had to solve. It began a month ago, a week before the alien ship arrived. To put things in context, none of us were in New Paris when the oracles appeared. We were on vacation in the Alps, planning to go camping and hiking in the mountains. It was sunny, it was hot, the weather was perfect for that. Our first 3 days of camping went well. We tested the mountain restaurants, we bathed in the lake after a good day's walk. Everything turned into a nightmare from the 4th day on. We got lost. Lost. Jake couldn't understand how anyone could get lost in the 22nd century. 13G was accessible everywhere on the planet except perhaps if you were living underground under a thick layer of heavy metals. Paul and his 3 friends all sighed at the same time. Their restless expressions showed that just remembering the events made them relive that nightmare. "We've really gotten lost," Paul replied. "But it wasn't our fault." Sarah intervened, anxious to justify herself. Jake could tell the twins apart because Elisa had a mole under her right eye. "True, but at the time, we didn't know that," added Kanye, who was the youngest of the group, only 18 years old. "Anyway, we were pretty lost," said Paul, continuing his story. "We decided to camp out under the stars and we got drunk. Still, it wasn't our first night camping, and we thought we knew where we were. Except that the next day on waking, we no longer recognized the landscape around us. We remembered a waterfall not far away, which we couldn't find again, and some rocks with painted signs that were supposed to serve as landmarks for the hikers. On top of that, we had barely left the trail when we pitched our tents. Of course, there was no network, which was supposed to be impossible. The next 3 days were an ordeal. We wandered up and down the mountain among the fir trees and brush, not finding our way back. We had supplies, but not enough, so it quickly became complicated. Sometimes we'd find a signpost indicating the right road, but we'd end up at dead ends when we followed it. It was the arrival of the oracles that unblocked the situation. When the drones appeared out of nowhere like a cloud of bugs covering the sky, we panicked and tried to escape. As you can imagine, we got caught. The 4 companions showed their bracelets as proof. At first we were pretty excited. We wanted to go home and the oracles gave us a path to follow. We thought the path would lead us to our car, and then we'd go home safely with it. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out as we had hoped. We walked for days. At first through the mountains and woods, then one day we reached a good old asphalt road. We all cried that day. After that, we finally reached a small town where we rented a car and we were able to go back to New Paris. I mean, we should have. We had the same problem as when we were at the campsite. We got lost again. The roads led nowhere, stopping in front of rivers or cliffs. The traffic signs didn't match the cities we were stopping at. A real ordeal. By following the path, we were still getting closer to the goal and the AIs on our bracelets were adamant, reminding us over and over again that the oracle could not be wrong. Seeing the town sign of a city we knew gave us hope, knowing that we were on the right path. This last week was the worst for us. Just so you know, we only made it to New Paris a few days ago. Jake was speechless. Their story looked straight out of a bad science fiction novel. Are you telling me that, aside from the first few days of hiking, you all spent almost 3 weeks driving to New Paris? How's that even possible? He couldn't help doubting them, it seemed too absurd. Not only is it true, but there are far worse things. We finally understood why we got lost when we started getting paranoid. By not closing our eyes, we ended up witnessing a disturbing scene, to say the least. We noticed that our landmarks were moving away from us, if not disappearing completely. It was really discreet, the kind of difference you only notice after several hours. When we did notice it, though, it was all we could see. Chapter 24 Paul's Story Part 2 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 24 Paul's Story Part 2 The Oracle Overseer tricked me. They knew all along. She commented with a chilling voice, halfway between despair and anger. What do you mean, he fooled you? Jake worried. Remember when I told you I hid the fact that the mouse didn't appear in your paths? Of course. It was supposed to be impossible, but you chose not to pass on this information to supposedly buy me some time. Jake repeated, still frustrated that he didn't know why. Well, it didn't do any good. According to your friend Paul's speech, what I wanted to prevent began before the oracles even arrived. Revealed she in a sinister tone. You mean to say that from the first time you reported the existence of this mouse, the Oracle Overseer was lying when he said the proof was insufficient? Exactly. And I still can't tell you why this is bad news until you raise your level of authority. While Jake and his AI were mentally chatting, Paul and his three friends paused, waiting for his blank stare to refocus on them. When Jake finished his mental conversation, Paul resumed his story. So, as I said, the landmarks we chose were moving. Simply put, our environment was changing all the time, but too slowly for us to notice. At least at first. We finally figured out why the Oracle was making us take all these weird, crazy detours. Basically, all the detours were just to get us back on the normal road. We soon realized that every time our route was abnormally blocked, it meant unknown territory. Unknown territory. Jake frowned. Bedouin, indeed. There's one thing I can vouch for after all we've been through. Every time we ventured into one of these lands, not by choice of course, but because the path demanded it, we left France. Wait, I need to make one thing clear. Jake stopped him, this time in complete bewilderment. If the phenomenon you describe is true, any satellite should have observed it. Or at least there's no way the government doesn't know about it. The group of friends laughed hoarsely, but their eyes did not smile. Jake could only read frustration and anguish on their faces. Of course they know. Confirmed Paul. But the situation is more complicated than it seems. You have no idea the interrogation we were subjected to by the military in order to get back to New Paris. We told them the same story we told you, but they weren't surprised or shocked. They just made us sign a contract that we would keep it secret, and one of the generals even answered some of our questions. Wait a minute. That's it. Jake interrupted him again. They let you in based on your good faith. Seems unthinkable to me. The easiest way to keep it a secret would have been to keep you quarantined outside the city. They could have, and they did in the beginning. Paul explained patiently. But that's no use now. What we went through is happening in New Paris right now. Jake pondered over the weight of those words and their implications. He hadn't noticed anything, but aside from practicing and staying home, he hadn't been interested in anything else. Do you mean that New Paris is losing pieces, or that some strange territories are appearing in the middle of the city? More or less, but the phenomenon is progressing much more slowly. Paul, tell him about the other problems we encountered before returning to New Paris. Reminded Kanye. Roads cut in half and unknown lands were scary, but never dangerous. Elisa and Sarah, the twins, shivered when he mentioned this detail. Clearly, they were not willing to relive this traumatic experience. Yeah, we got in trouble. At first, it was nothing bad. It was scary, but it was still within the realm of possibility. We ran into a bear on our hike that totally ignored us, and then a female boar charged us a few days later. We had no luck, but we never thought anything was wrong. It was only afterwards that it got worse. About a week after the oracles arrived, we came across our first nightmare. We came across a wolf carcass split in two on the roadside. We thought of all kinds of possibilities, like getting run over or being attacked by a bear, but it didn't look like that. Anyway, we got the hell out of there. The second weirdness was when we tried to fill up the gas tank. With the environment making no sense, we were in constant fear of running out of gas. We'd fill up at any station that we saw. In the beginning, everything was normal. The small towns or villages where we stopped were normally inhabited, often with a gas station attendant present to greet us when we filled up. Unfortunately, that didn't last. To be frank, during the last week we spent on the roads, all the villages we stopped in were deserted. Not a living soul for miles around. We even came across a small town that was missing half of its buildings. The last few days, we literally didn't run into anyone. We really thought for a while that we were the last human beings left alive. Luckily, we ran into an army-escorted transport truck and followed them all the way to New Paris. There are still two more things to tell you. The first is that, as with the ghost towns, there were no more animals towards the end. No insects, no birds, nothing. Oh, we did come across a few beasts, but we all decided it was best to stay as far away from those horrors as possible. Let me guess, suggested Jake, falsely enthusiastic. Animals that look normal, but have translucent skin, creepy air, abnormal strength and ferocity and no oracle on their paw. Paul, Kanye and the twins stared at him in amazement. Did you see them too? Elisa exclaimed, glad she had not gone insane. Yes, a mouse as big as a rat that devoured two stray cats right in front of me. Oh my gods. Sarah and Kanye were livid when they heard that. They had done so well to stay away from those creatures. If a mouse can do that, it explains a lot. Paul replied. It wasn't a mouse we saw, it was a chihuahua. It may seem funny at first, but when it's the only living thing in a ghost town, it feels completely different. It was devouring the corpse of a Saint Bernard Mastiff. Speaking of dogs. Did you maybe notice the empty doghouse in front of my parents' house? Indeed, Jake nodded, remembering the doghouse in the middle of the fallow garden. Without knowing why, the garden had left an austere and gloomy impression on him. Well, my dog's dead, announced Paul with an unexpected coldness. Apparently, a few days before we came home, the dog started barking like crazy in the middle of the night. My parents ignored it at first, but then it stopped and they went back to sleep. In the morning, they found half a paw in front of his kennel. For the record, my dog was a well-trained German Shepherd dog, the perfect guard dog. And the gate was closed. My parents thought it was a crime and reported it to the police, but to not. Even they didn't really believe it. Even if Jake was twice as dumb, he wouldn't believe that one of those damn mutant bugs had nothing to do with it. The image of the dismembered cat being dragged in the dark was still vivid in his memory. And the last thing you wanted to tell me? Jake asked, preferring to refocus the conversation on the main topic. Ah, the latest scoop. This is a piece of information we managed to scrape together from the general who interrogated us. You see, even though we realized that pieces of roads or cities were disappearing, we unconsciously thought that somehow the planet was growing. Well, it's the opposite. The Earth is shrinking. And very rapidly at that. Or rather, it's slowly being transported away. Chapter 25 Flirting with Camille. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Jake was stunned after Paul's speech. The Earth was shrinking at this very moment and he hadn't noticed anything all this time. According to him, his planet wasn't really disappearing but was actually being absorbed or transported somewhere else. The problem was that if it was just the Earth being transported, there would have been some pretty obvious anomalies, like the disappearance of the moon or the sun, perhaps a change in the constellations. None of that occurred. However, according to the story of Paul and his friends, some places on Earth were being replaced by lands that were far too strange to exist on their planet. This meant at least one thing. It didn't make any sense. Even if the Earth was connected to parallel worlds or different spaces were superimposed on top of each other, the result should be much more chaotic. Jake's feeling was that the Earth was gradually shattering into pieces like you would smash a puzzle into thousands of fragments. These pieces of land were then randomly recombined with other pieces belonging to other worlds. There was no evidence to support his theory, but without knowing the reason, he was almost convinced that his instincts were right. This kind of visceral certainty was not something he could ignore so easily. Between the disappearing animals, and more recently the humans in small towns and villages, there was plenty of room for paranoia. Even if there were strange monsters like that terrifying mouse or that cannibal chihuahua, the truth was that there weren't that many of them. The first sociopath or serial killer that would came along was probably killing more than these mutated animals. If pieces of Earth could disappear like that, transporting humans should be even simpler. Since he had discovered the existence of the Oracle devices, he found this hypothesis more than plausible. "Paul, I appreciate you revealing all this to me, I really do." Jake thanked him from the bottom of his heart. "But it still doesn't explain why. What do you have to gain by telling me all this?" This time even his own friends looked at Paul curiously. Kanye, Elisa and Sarah trusted him, but it was the first time the trio met Jake. Paul had described Jake as a very ordinary employee, whom he barely knew by name. Yet their first impression of him was very different. About 6 feet tall, rather good-looking, with sharp muscles. He had a strange way of expressing himself, rarely smiled and showed little emotion. But other than that, he was rather calm and took them much more seriously than they had initially hoped. "As I told you earlier, you are in one of my paths," Paul explained embarrassedly. "When I came back to New Paris, I couldn't sleep for the first 2 days because I was so tense. I was so afraid of dying or being kidnapped in my sleep that I had become completely insomniac. At some point, I made a wish. To survive this end of the world. I understood right away when I saw you practicing in the room that your oracle had given you a similar path. The only difference is that mine wanted me to meet you beforehand and tell you all of this." "You mean to tell me that according to your oracle, inviting me tonight and revealing all this information directly increases your chances of surviving what's coming next?" Jake summarized, unable to fathom the logic behind this plan. "Apparently. But, don't ask me why, I haven't the faintest idea. So many possibilities." Indeed, there were many possibilities that could justify this meeting. Just going to Paul's house could have a decisive impact. These revelations could help him to alter his plans, or they could just blow away the flames of his fear, preventing him from relaxing and falling back into his customary laziness. After this revelation, the quartet returned to the living room, carrying with them the much awaited pizzas. They tried to have fun and enjoy the party with everyone as if nothing happened. Jake had lost his interest in that party and was barely able to look the part, falsely chuckling at Harry and Thru's jokes. Maybe to forget his anxieties or to do like everyone else, he started to drink more and more. At first, the atmosphere remained reserved and friendly, then as the evening progressed, beers and wines were replaced by shots and cocktails of strong alcohol, such as tequilas or mojitos. When Jake's blood alcohol level exceeded a certain threshold, he finally began to disinhibit and relax, suddenly becoming much more expressive and cheerful. He then decided to return to his original plan while he was still sober enough to do the living missions to improve his communication skills. The missions were nonsensical, simply challenging his comfort zone. Unfortunately, he could not choose his missions. He had to fulfill the conditions of one challenge in order to discover the next one. Mission: hold eye contact with one of the present girls for at least 10 seconds, then wink at her teasingly. "Oh, crap. I don't think I've had enough to drink yet." Panicked Jake, instantly pouring himself a shot of vodka to give himself some courage. Half an hour later and after 3, maybe 4 more shots, Jake was finally tipsy, with a renewed courage that only alcohol had the secret. Okay, here we go. Not caring at all about the consequences, he finally began to reason like the rational egoist he had always been. He probably wouldn't see any of these people again, so why bother with the consequences? Jake scanned each of the guests, trying to catch the attention, even briefly, of one of the women nearby. Miraculously, Camille was looking in his direction. Before he even realized that he knew this person and that she was his superior, he had already stared at her for more than 5 seconds. To his great misfortune, Camille maintained eye contact, seeming to be amused by his reaction. Unless she wasn't looking at Jake, but at someone or something behind him. Holy shit. She just smiled back at him. Either way, the alcohol was going to his head, and considering Camille's flushed face, she wasn't much sober either. Mission. Hold eye contact with one of the girls present for at least 10 seconds, and then wink at her teasingly. Mission accomplished, perfect rating. Authority level. Plus 1%, without even realizing it, he had accomplished his mission. Jake became aware that he had unconsciously followed a path to properly time his wink and attitude. It seemed that by being more alcoholic than usual his spontaneity in using the oracle had increased. Encouraged by this first success, he started the second mission. Mission. Engage in conversation with Camille with an original compliment that she would be proud of, but not used to hearing. Jake drew a deep breath. Between holding her eyes and complimenting her directly, there was a chasm that his shyness couldn't cross. He drank another shot, then poured himself another drink before taking his courage in both hands and accosting Camille. To his great despair, Camille hadn't stopped staring at him, watching his strange quirks. As he walked towards her, all of his neurons were working at the same time in search of the perfect opener. Alas, his usual cleverness seemed to have deserted him. Desperate, he decided to continue with his oracle, mimicking his shadow guide once again. How are you doing, Camille? We never took the time to really talk. I wanted to apologize for leaving work so abruptly. I guess it hasn't been easy to replace me. Jake began, in a cordial tone, and ran his hand through his hair with an awkward look on his face that made him seem troubled. Don't worry about it. At first with only Harry to run the center it was complicated, but after a week no one came in, so we closed the shop. Camille relieved him of his guilt with an encouraging smile. Thank God. I was afraid you were angry with me. No, don't worry about it. I'm not the type to hold a grudge for so little. Anyway, I just wanted to say that your curly hair looks great today. Combined with the dress you chose, you look lovely. Jake finally managed to reach his target. Mission. Engage in conversation with Camille with an original compliment that she would be proud of, but not used to hearing. Mission accomplished, perfect rating. Authority level. Plus 1%, one more mission accomplished. It was time to move on to third base. Thank you, Jake, you have no idea how good it makes me feel to hear that. I spent so much time curling them up, I didn't think anyone would notice. I'm not very good at finding the right words, but I've always been attentive to the details that nobody pays attention to. You can get a lot of information just by looking at people. Jake boasted, with an embarrassed smile. Really? If I point out this person, what do you guess from their appearance? Camille decided to test him at his own game, showing him Kanye's older brother, who had broken the ice with them earlier that evening. With his looks and clothes he's. After that, Jake continued to chat with Camille, taking on missions that were increasingly difficult for an introvert like him. When the difficulty became too great, such as when he had to invite her to dance or pull something out of her hair, he would use it as an excuse to go back for a drink. Camille drank with him and without realizing it, they became closer and closer. The problem was that as his level of drunkenness increased, he began to diverge more and more from the paths he was supposed to follow. With the help of alcohol, he found ideas of his own to satisfy the conditions of his missions, but he also increasingly revealed his true nature, an unfiltered cynicism and black humor. This did not displease Camille, entranced by his new personality. She realized for the first time that Jake, the least cooperative employee in her VR center, was in fact an exciting person to listen to with a personality full of nuances. Then finally came the fateful mission. Kiss Camille. At this point in the evening. It wasn't even midnight. Jake was so drunk that he couldn't even tell his right from his left. He was totally freewheeling. Unfortunately, that didn't stop him from having an adrenaline rush, his heart pounding. For the umpteenth time, he excused himself and ran to the toilet to empty his bladder. A few people were waiting their turn before him, so he waited. Meanwhile, the previous drinks were still taking effect. When he finally came out of the toilet, he had completely forgotten about Camille and fell asleep on one of the sofas like a drunk homeless man on a sidewalk. When he woke up a few hours later, he was sober and feeling better. Dazed, the memories of his exploits with Camille came back to him and he started to panic, looking for her. A part like him had drunk too much and had gone to bed in the guest rooms. The others were still dancing or chatting over a drink. A few seconds later, he finally found Camille, and with her through. They were intertwined and glued together on the dance floor like two octopuses giving each other mouth-to-mouth. At that moment, Jake threw up. Chapter 26 Aggression. You're listening at novelfull.audio. Disgusted by the conclusion of the evening, Jake decided to leave without telling anyone. He was so close to kissing Camille and because of his drunkenness he had ruined everything, giving the chance to someone else. Nevertheless, he wasn't naive for all that. Camille was almost as drunk as he was, but she was not such an easy girl as far as he knew. Thru, despite his obesity and a more than exotic body odor, had always been the most confident and sociable of their group. Unlike him, Thru had known Camille for years. Yet, since all this time, nothing had happened between them. If Jake was angry with himself, he refused to believe that Thru hadn't premeditated his move from the beginning. Every time he thought about the fact that Thru had patiently followed his path, which had probably kindly advised him to wait for Jake to sabotage himself, he couldn't help but grit his teeth in fury. If he hadn't left like a tornado without saying goodbye to anyone, he might have pulverized that spice-smelling pile of fat. Naturally, he was mostly ashamed of himself, through being just a scapegoat to protect his ego. So Jake found himself wandering the sidewalks of New Paris at 5 o'clock in the morning, walking slowly and staggering from time to time. He had already sobered up quite a bit, but a hangover due to dehydration was starting to set in. At such an early hour of the morning there was not a single person out on the roads, and the lack of moonlight that night made the streets he roamed look ominous and frightening. Nevertheless, with his bad temper, he didn't give a damn about all this. If he had been more attentive or a little soberer, he would have realized that the way back was about 20.5 meters shorter, or that the number of buildings jumped abruptly from 14 to 18 on the even side and 13 to 17 on the odd side of the street. He also failed to notice the hooded individual following him a few minutes away from his home, licking his lips thinking he had found an ideal prey. Once Jake started rummaging through his pockets looking for the keys to his apartment, he heard the sound of thumping footsteps approaching at full speed. As his blood alcohol level had already dropped during his solitary walk, he somehow managed to react in time. He stepped aside as he turned around, surprised for a moment by his own dexterity. Within a millisecond he picked up the characteristic shine of a knife. A visceral fear gripped him head on, the adrenaline rush that followed increasing his level of vigilance and making his heart beat hard enough to raise his body temperature by 1 degree. By sheer reflex, he managed to grab the attacker's arm at the cost of being stabbed in the right hip. Out of survival instinct, he had managed to deflect the attacker's blow to a non-vital area. Unfortunately, he was poorly positioned and could do nothing to stop the momentum of the assassin's charge. As he fell to the ground, tackled by his assailant, he struck hard with his elbow on the forearm carrying the blade, causing the assailant to drop his weapon with a hmmf of choking pain. Once on the ground, Jake rolled backwards, then in pure rage crushed his attacker's nose with his foot. That was enough to make the attacker let go, giving him the respite he needed. Fuck. Jake growled, painfully getting up with his hand pressed against his wound, the knife still stuck in his belly. It bled a lot, it hurt like hell, but he would survive. Only if nothing worse happened, though. Huffing and puffing like a smoker with terminal lung cancer and fully focused on the killer in front of him, he didn't notice that they had left the main street. Under other circumstances, he would have recognized the alley where 2 stray cats had been devoured before his very eyes 3 weeks earlier. After all, it was only a stone's throw from his house. The assailant in front of him had also stood up and cackled like a psychopath despite his deformed nose and the blood coming out of it. He was obstructing Jake's path, preventing him from leaving the alley and going home. Ha 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 ha. Finally, a prey worthy of me. Oh my oracle, give me the strength to defeat this heretic. Psalmodiated the lunatic as he spoke to his bracelet as if it were a sacred goddess. What the fuck is this maniac? Snarled Jake, cursing his bad luck. 1. The world was coming to an end. 2. He had his one-night stand stolen by a guy he physically outperformed on every level, and now an attempt on his life. He was so enraged, that he momentarily forgot that in front of him stood a serial killer, wanted in vain by the police force. He was part of a small class of criminals who saw the Oracle's missions as divine orders. The great strength of the Oracle bracelets was that in order to promote the best possible evolution of their hosts, the missions and opportunities offered by the coaching ability were always in accordance with the personal values and objectives, conscious or not, of its owner. A madman like this serial killer had also received an AI as crazy as he was, behaving like a divine emissary and encouraging him to commit ever more daring and challenging crimes. Regardless of why the oracles helped their hosts fulfill their dreams, or become better versions of themselves, morality had nothing to do with it. The AIs were not chosen to straighten out deviants or even cure them of their madness. Quite the contrary. The AIs of the oracle were selected to best serve the ambitions of their bearer. A rapist would get an AI sharing the same vices, while a pedophile could perfectly receive an AI with the voice of a child, backing him up in every atrocity he would commit. Between the fear of dying and the excitement of the upcoming battle, Jake could barely feel the pain in his hip. However, he had no idea how to escape from this predicament. If it wasn't for the irrational behavior of the madman in front of him, he could never have broken his nose so easily. Still wheezing, he tried to calm himself with deep breaths, looking for a breach in his opponent's guard. The murderer in front of him had pulled out a second knife identical to the one stuck in his hip, presumably overexcited at the idea of a fight to the death against his prey. The murderer approached him cautiously, one step at a time, whispering obscenities meant to reassure him, as a farmer would do before beheading a hen. Then came the fateful moment. Ready to get rid of the obstacle in front of him, all of Jake's muscles contracted, his veins doubling in size under the strain. One more step and he would charge like a rabid hippopotamus, ready to clear a path at any cost. After that, all he would have to do was run home, barricade himself in his building and call the police. That chance never came. As his breathing became more and more jerky from the pressure of failing his dash, a shadow fell on his attacker's skull. Arrgh. The murderer was screaming his head off, struggling with all his might. The unidentified shadow of about 50 centimeters clung to his neck, lacerating and devouring the pieces of flesh within its reach. Any fighting will on Jake's part deflated like a souffle, replaced by a sense of despair out of proportion to his earlier fear. He watched, nailed in place, the so-confident assassin being eaten alive by a mouse as big as a bulldog. But when a geyser of blood splashed down on his face after the mouse had torn out the poor man's carotid artery, he came out of his stupor. Clear-headed again, he took a quick look around him, finally realizing what alley he was standing on. One nap hadn't been enough to detoxify him from all his alcohol. The walk home had not prevented him from shivering non-stop. Even a criminal wanting his life didn't put an end to his headache. He just ignored it, as he ignored his hip injury. But the scene from a horror movie unfolding in front of him eclipsed all other feelings. For the first time, he knew what he had to do. Run away. Absolutely not. That monster would immediately fall on him from behind. Stay home. With a carnivorous mutant mouse that had tripled in size in a single month just a few steps away from home. He would rather die now. Jake, kill that thing. Ordered she, with a kind of urgency in her scream. If we don't dispose of it now while it is still busy eating that man, we're screwed. Jake's eyes hardened, determination replaced indecision. Weeks of nightmares over a fucking mouse. Did it get a little bigger? And then what? The target would just be easier to nail. Either I get out of this alley alive tonight, or I end up in a rodent turd right here. Jake kept repeating to himself, to eliminate the slightest trace of reluctance. The mutant mouse was now feeding on its victim, paying no attention to Jake, who hadn't moved an eyelash since the slaughter began. The body of its attacker would occasionally twitch from time to time, but the body had already been dead for a long while. Steady and clenching his teeth, Jake pulled the knife out of his wound. A stream of blood began to flow down his trousers, a small puddle gradually forming at his feet. Gradually, he regained control of his breath and an icy cold composure stifled all his emotions. The time had come to gamble with his life. Man or mouse, there could only be one. Chapter 27: A Fight to the Death. You are listening at novelfull.audio. First, Jake activated Prediction to obtain the perfect plan. His reaction time was not yet good enough to follow his shadow guide during a fight to the death. His actions would be too slow, delayed far too much to respond adequately to his opponent. However, he just needed to know the first move. One move, one kill, that was his plan all along. The path emerged, revealing the perfect move to perform. The shadow guide preceded his movements by a brief second, but remained, totally motionless, adding to his already high stress. Jake tried to stay focused, forcing himself to take long breaths. Whether he would see the sun this morning or not, depended entirely on his composure. After a few minutes that seemed endless for him, the shadow guide finally showed some changes. A movement was finally shown to him. A clean and efficient hit, if perfectly executed, to kill the mutant mouse instantly. The move seemed simple at first, but was strangely complex. To be executed correctly, it required a well-trained body in excellent coordination. Anyone could watch a tutorial video on the internet explaining how to perform a break dance figure or a technical gesture from a choreography. But how many could do it right the first time? That was Jake's current situation. To succeed, he needed to be more focused than ever. The 3 weeks of training to do all sorts of weird moves finally made sense. Besides the physical conditioning it provided, it prepared his body to respond to the commands of the shadow guide. The horrible translucent creature continued to ignore him, too busy reveling in his prey. Jake could see chunks of his attacker's flesh being chewed into the creature's jaw and then slide down the esophagus as the beast swallowed. The digestion was awfully fast, with the ingested food dispersing into the monster's stomach and then the small intestine like an effervescent tablet into a glass of water. After that, the nutrients would enter the bloodstream, reaching every cell in the body in a few heartbeats. Jake couldn't believe his eyes. Worse, he could see the creature's body changing second by second. It wasn't obvious at first, but after a few minutes of feasting, it was slightly different. A little bigger, but nothing excessive. On the other hand, its claws had grown a full centimeter longer and seemed sharper than ever before. There was also a strange silvery glow pulsating in the monster's eyes. It was too much for Jake's nerves to handle. He gritted his teeth and took action. There was no room for error and he was so focused that he felt like he was living the scene in slow motion. He let himself tip forward, then when his body formed a 30-degree angle with the ground, he pushed with all his strength on his legs to pounce on his target. At the same time, he slashed forward with his knife raised, aiming for the neck. If he succeeded, the beast would be decapitated with a single stroke. If he failed, he would be on his own. And to fail, he failed. When he was less than 50 centimeters from his initial target, the mouse looked at him on alert. Its mouth was still chewing and full of blood, but there was only fierce rage and malevolence on its face. Absolutely no fear could be felt, just an undisguised disdain for a creature disturbed during its meal. Before Jake could understand anything, his knife plunged into the dead serial killer's shoulder instead of his intended target. No blood spatter this time, the victim being completely exsanguinated. The mouse had fully vamped him already. In response, the mouse jumped on his face after dodging the killing stroke by twisting its own neck like a snake. For a brief millisecond, Jake was overcome with despair, thinking, "It's over." Then his reflexes took over, and remembering the futile death of his previous attacker, he raised both arms to protect his face and neck. The creature hit its left arm instead of its head, and then bit the first lump of meat within jaw's reach. The mouse had a chewing strength comparable to that of a tiger, and if the beast had been any bigger, it would probably have ripped off its arm. Instead, he kept his arm, but the rodent's teeth went into his biceps, stopping upon contact with the humerus. Simultaneously, the damn thing clutched like a gold digger at the arm of a billionaire, lacerating his tattered arm with its claws. The shadow guide was now useless, and Jake's pain was so paroxysmal that he couldn't have paid attention anyway. But paradoxically, in his suffering and sense of helplessness, he reacted in the most banal but terribly effective way against this carnivorous ersatz of a koala that was mistaking his arm for a tree trunk. "Will you get off me, you piece of shit?" Jake screamed with an unbridled rage gushing out from the depths of his soul. The alley was narrow, and he was trapped between two walls to his left and right. He slammed into the nearest wall and performed the most violent backhand stroke of his left arm in his entire life. The outside of his arm crashed against the concrete wall at full power, the mouse serving as his airbag. The first impact loosened the monster's teeth. The second impact caused the monster to squeak with pain, relieving Jake of his own. On the third impact, the rodent let go and slid down the wall, half knocked out. The next few minutes Jake released all his frustration from the past few weeks. He kicked and kicked the mouse, like a football player would kick a soccer ball for a penalty. After the first few blows, the creature stopped screaming for good. Unfortunately, the body still jerked by reflex from time to time, and Jake had no intention of leaving any room for chance. He continued to strike until the monster was nothing more than a fine bloody mush splattered against the wall. In his moment of madness, he didn't notice the Oracle's notifications scrolling one after the other. Only his survival instincts governed his body, and it told him to continue until he was certain that the enemy had been annihilated. And with a mutant monster like that, he could expect anything, conventional logic not necessarily being a good advisor when dealing with alien things. Finally, after an incalculable time, and when he was so out of breath that he couldn't stand upright, she's soft and reassuring voice chimed in his ears. "You can stop, Jake. The digester is dead." The physically and mentally exhausted young man didn't notice at that moment the strange energy evaporating from the corpse and being sucked through his bracelet. If he could see the phenomenon, he would have described it as a kind of silvery stream of light. If his eyesight was even better, and he could zoom in and out a few quintillion times, he could have discovered how this energy formed a kind of code. An energetic code, like the DNA, was a biological one. But as these strange symbols were being swallowed up by his bracelet in an uninterrupted manner, they were infinitely compressed, losing their structure and becoming pure energy again. A moment later, Jake finally crossed the threshold of his door. He had left the half-eaten corpse of the criminal and the crushed carcass of the mouse as they were in the middle of the alley. If a passerby discovered the scene of carnage the next day, he was good for PTSD. Jake disinfected, then dressed his wound, which was starting to hurt like hell again now that the adrenaline was going down. After that, he slumped down on his couch, looking lost. That night had definitely been way too eventful for him. Crunch for once seemed to sense his master's distress and trotted beside him, sniffing his bloody shoes, only to finally curl up on his lap, purring with satisfaction. Jake couldn't be sure, but he could have sworn that the cat had recognized the smell of the mouse on his body. The damn thing had been a nightmare for both the owner and the cat, and knowing it was gone was extremely soothing to their minds. Only for the cats, though. As for Jake, he couldn't help thinking that mutated monsters like that one, there must be thousands of others in New Paris alone. A few weeks before, the mouse was already brave enough to attack alley cats, but not yet bold enough to attack him, a human. That night had changed all that. He now had proof that these monsters no longer feared his kind, and that meant that any walk in New Paris was now a matter of life and death. He couldn't wall himself off at home if he wanted to continue training, but his unarmed days were behind him. Uncle Kalen's weapons had been delivered some time ago. From guns to assault rifles, from military knives to nano-carbon fiber katana, he was equipped enough to take on an army. Now it was time to find out what all the notifications that had flashed before his eyes during his fight to the death were for. Chapter 28 Digesters and Dream Ether. You are listening at novelfull.audio. First, he focused on his mental link with the Oracle device, checking what all the messages he had received during and after his battle were about. There were many notifications, so he went back to the oldest one to get a clearer picture. You killed a Digester rank 0. Your authority level is automatically promoted to the next higher rank. Authority level. Recruit, rank 1, 0/10,000, what the heck? Jake snapped, his eyes bulging out as he read the first line of data. He remembered She's words congratulating him on his victory, and the term digester had indeed been mentioned. What he was sure of was that she had never used that word before, although it would have clearly been much appreciated by him. So why use this term all of a sudden? The only logical explanation was the increase in his authority level, whose promotion must have been effective immediately after the monster's death. I have a lot of questions for you," commanded Jake, with a patibular expression, leaving no room for a no. "I'm ready, Jake." She sighed, long prepared for the upcoming interrogation. "Okay, first question, what the fuck is a digester?" Jake asked. "Sure, that shit knew how to digest fast. The explanations I'm about to give you are still limited by your rank as well as my own knowledge on the subject, do your best." "All right. To sum them up in one sentence, they are the enemy of us all. The reason why every living being has been given an oracle device is indirectly related to their existence. I guess I should have known better. Receiving those oracles for free was too good to be true." Jake commented, bitter-faced. "It's more complicated than that. Primitive races like the ones on Earth are not supposed to receive oracles so early. The invasion of your planet more than 22 years ago had far-reaching consequences. We've been invaded. I figured the government response was too quiet and the alien ship handed out the oracles out of nowhere. You were invaded, but not by the aliens who delivered the oracles to you. I understand why those aliens came to help us if they're at war with the digesters, but why did the digesters come after us then? In your own words, we're primitive. If there's such a threat that these highly evolved aliens need our help to defend themselves, it doesn't make much sense," Jake said, putting his finger on what was bothering him. "And that's the limit of what your rank of authority allows me to reveal." She stopped him, cutting off his thoughts. "What I can say, however, is that the digesters found you. When sufficiently evolved life forms are concentrated in one place in too great numbers, you give off a kind of signal that is very appealing to them. Then why now and not sooner?" Jake shrugged. "If we're talking about evolved life forms, back in the age of dinosaurs the animals were much more massive and the flora much denser, with richer oxygen content. What I mean by advanced life forms are sentient species, with sufficient intelligence. It generates something that attracts them, but once they find you, whether you're a human or the stupidest sea anemone, they devour everything the same. Okay, I get it. He didn't get it at all. Since when did thinking or being intelligent emit a signal strong enough to be detected from the depths of the universe? That would have been known by now, and they would have all become telepaths. I can't explain it yet. But you'll understand when the time comes. The AI tried in vain to appease him. Just keep in mind that the digesters have only one goal: to feed. They need more and more energy, and they use it to keep growing and evolving. Their evolution has no limits, as long as they have energy available. In fact, he had seen first-hand how this mouse had developed before his eyes after ingesting the flesh of the deceased psychopath. Even though these creatures can evolve by feeding on their victims, it's not enough to make them a threat to an alien race as advanced as the one that created the Oracle. Jake argued, pointing out another incongruity. Indeed. She admitted with a sad tone. The problem isn't the digesters per se. Across the universe, there are life forms so mysterious that even the most powerful digesters would be powerless against them. The real problem is the way the digesters appear and multiply. Digesters are born out of nothing, feeding on primordial energy. They take on the appearance of the flora and fauna of the surrounding planets. They start out as small animals or plants, and then when the available energy increases or they have fed enough, they move in different directions. Some like this mouse just evolve as a predator. More massive, faster, stronger. Others will become contaminators, turning their victims into new digesters. To do this, the least dangerous will develop a simple poison, such as venom, while the worst will emit bacteria or viruses. Shit. Jake swore when he heard the last sentence. So, interrupt me if I'm wrong, a digester out there could make me a zombie in its service just by releasing its remastered version of the coronavirus. Basically, yes. She confirmed his concerns. These digesters, however, are very rare, and this is an obstacle to their own evolution, since by turning their prey into digesters they lose access to their food source. Consider that they are not your problem at the moment. Those who contaminate by contact with their claws or fangs, on the other hand, you have to be prepared for that. The simplest way is to increase your constitution and vitality, or more specifically your immune system. With proper precautions and the right medication, it's the safest way to deal with a digester infection. It made sense, but we were going back to the previous case where Jake was wondering how to increase his intelligence beyond human limits. She had told him that he would have an element of answer by increasing his level of authority. Okay, but how do I do that? Jake took advantage of the AI's response to change the subject. Even if I decide to train my ass off for years, I doubt the strongest athlete can survive or endure a virus produced by an alien species capable of constant evolution. You're right. That wouldn't be enough. Earthlings are considered inferior species precisely because you don't know how to use the primordial energy we call dream ether, or ether for short. Dream ether. What is that? Radioactivity. An elementary particle or radiation perhaps. Jake couldn't see what more primordial energy could exist based on his knowledge of physics. None of the above. She denied. Remember when I explained that the digesters were born spontaneously out of nothingness? They tap into the dream ether. To get enough energy to spawn, on Earth it takes about 22 years. Oh, I see. I guess your alien friends came to help us, but they missed all the eggs the digesters left as a parting gift. That's exactly what happened. Digesters are not born from eggs, this is a very complex matter. If this were the case, the number of digesters being born would stabilize after a while. This is not the case. Then where did they come from? Jake wondered out loud. Authority level insufficient. Do note that any area where digesters spawn from the atmosphere without warning will continue to generate them forever. Holy crap. He cursed for real this time. Their planet was ruined for good. No wonder it was being absorbed into tiny pieces somewhere. Probably the cosmic version of recycling. Okay, so what is this dream ether we humans are supposedly too stupid to use? Jake started the conversation again, hoping to take his mind off it. Ether is the cleanest primordial energy you can get. It's abundant, even on Earth, even if it's nothing compared to other places. If there's so much of it, why hasn't anyone ever talked about it? Let me ask you a question, Jake. What should be the qualities of an ideal clean energy to use? I'd say easy to use, not wasteful. And how do you detect energy of any kind? She asked again, guiding his thinking. By an observable effect, heat, light, or movement. Jake had finally figured out what she was trying to explain. That's right. The perfect energy is undetectable. No waste, no manifestation of its existence. You could be bathing in an ocean of ether right now, enough to create another Big Bang, and you still wouldn't notice anything. That brings us to the Oracle's other notifications after you've upgraded your rank. Your bracelet has unlocked some new features that you won't be displeased with and are specifically dedicated to the management of the ether. Chapter 29 New Features. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After she's recall, Jake turned his attention to the remaining notifications. New Oracle features unlocked. The new features unlocked are as follows. Compress, encode, ether storage, logging and mapping. As he discovered the new features, Jake mentally focused on his wristband link, memorizing all the information about the new functionalities in an instant. Jake got a mild headache from absorbing all this data, but nothing his brain could not handle. After a moment of digesting all this information, he finally got the gist of it. The Oracle device was able to passively absorb the dream ether to function. That explained how his bracelet was getting its energy. He had originally made several hypotheses, such as solar energy, or even his own body heat, but never received a clear answer from 11. Well, that was it. In spite of this, he did not clearly understand the use of certain functions, for lack of examples. Compress was supposed to compress the ether into its original, undenatured form, while encode was supposed to transform this energy into another, more easily usable form. Ether storage spoke for itself. The Oracle device stored the harvested dream ether whether for its own use or to encode it into another form. He was surprised to discover that his ether storage was not empty. Ether storage. 0.2 points, it seemed ridiculously little, but he had no reliable reference to refer to. Where did the ether in my bracelet come from? Jake asked, genuinely curious for once. Half of it corresponds to the dream ether passively accumulated in the Earth's atmosphere. The other half was obtained from the digester's remains. Jake frowned, adopting a contrite expression. It was blatantly obvious that the Oracle wanted to encourage them to exterminate the digesters rather than twiddling their thumbs and doing nothing. Why has the Oracle bracelet recovered so little in all this time? Jake asked again. 2 reasons. 1. Dream ether's density on Earth isn't very high. She explained patiently. The second, the Oracle device evolves with its wearer. At rank 0, most functions are disabled or limited, including the absorption of dream ether. Now, with rank 1, the rate of accumulation should have doubled. It's different when the ether is retrieved from a victim. Other forces come into play to make the ether more accessible. Even so, about 95% of the dream ether is considered wasted during compression. Okay, it's already clearer. What about the encode function? And what use can I make of this ether once it's been processed? The encoded ether is your ticket to evolve beyond human limits. She revealed, marking a moment of silence. Everything you humans would call supernatural like soul or magic cannot be explained by the laws of conventional physics. Otherwise, you would have long recognized their existence. Wait a second. Jake stopped her, suddenly flabbergasted. You mean the soul and magic aren't just fairy tales? For an agnostic like him, it was an extremely reassuring epiphany. At least there was something beyond his death. Death was no longer the end of the road. Yes and no. I'm sorry to disappoint you and all the believers of different religions on earth, but the soul as you understand it is not so simple to acquire. You mean when we die, we're done for? His enthusiasm had just been snuffed out like a candle extinguished by a bucket of water. For the earthlings, unfortunately, yes. All your religious concepts acknowledge the existence of the soul, but mostly to comfort you. An inescapable law of the universe is that what can be created can be destroyed. Even the soul as the oracle understands it is not invincible. Actually, you don't have a soul either. All your memories, your emotions are mostly contained in your brain. If I change the hormonal balance, the levels of neurotransmitters or surgically remove/destroy parts of your brain, your personality will change irrevocably. Even cases of amnesia recovery are not valid proof of the soul, since these recoveries are biologically explainable. In this case, how do you get a soul? In dying, there is a residual trace of electrical or quantum activity in your brain. If nothing is done to conserve it, it will eventually disperse for lack of energy. However, if this proto-soul could use the dream ether for sustenance, it would have a chance to survive and grow stronger. It is not impossible at the moment of death for a human to have a moment of enlightenment and understand how to save his soul, but these are too rare cases to mention. On the other hand, the oracle is not all powerful. It is possible that the concept of an immortal soul as you conceive it exists. But even the oracle cannot verify these claims. Again, this is a matter of personal faith. But if I can give you some advice to take seriously, forming a stable soul should be one of your top priorities. Some abilities are just beyond the capabilities of a biological brain or an inorganic processor. And how am I supposed to do that? First things first. The first thing you need to know is that you can use your oracle device to apply pure ether directly to your own body. You only have to wish it with your mind, but I wouldn't recommend it. It would be the stupidest thing you could ever do. Why, what's wrong with using it like that? Jake was under the impression that this energy only had benefits. The problem is the same reason a newborn on Earth has as much dream ether as an old man or a rock. Just as a warm body passively transfers heat to colder bodies, natural ether flows to less concentrated environments. If you soak in ether, you'll lose it like a flame loses its heat in the middle of a blizzard. However, this is also the reason why some life forms are superior to humans. If you lived on a planet with a higher concentration of ether, you'd see all your faculties increase in a short time. Jake thought long and hard about Shi's words, but he couldn't find any inconsistencies. The only thing he could think of was that using ether directly was what some more evolved species could do naturally without the help of the oracle. The functions of his bracelet were really just crutches until he could do the same. Then how do I use the encode function? Jake asked this time. He was determined not to lag behind on this. Encode preforms the ether in a usable way. Dream ether is an energy that makes everything possible, but to make use of it the energy must be encoded. To make an analogy, your body is the way it is because each of your cells is governed by a common DNA. You don't need to know why your blood is red, why your eyes are blue, or how your cells divide. It's just the way it is. DNA is a genetic code, which regulates your biology. Every living being also has an etheric code. But in primitive life forms, this code is extremely simple. It is a simple energy signature. Each signature is different. Even two twins with identical genetic codes do not have the same etheric code. Every magical power, cultivation technique with miraculous effects or unexplained psychic powers can be explained by this code. The problem is that understanding this code is impossible for an earthling. After all, this is about the primordial laws of the universe. You have a better chance of altering your own genetic code than venturing to manipulate your etheric signature. That's where encode comes in. It can transform the ether into energy that can be used specifically to enhance your attributes. Even though the ether has no color, the oracle has assigned colors to these different energies so that you can easily differentiate between them. It is the same for all alien races using the oracle. Red for strength, orange for agility, yellow for constitution, green for vitality, cyan for intelligence and indigo for perception. There are other colors, but they don't apply to you yet. There is a reason why the colors of the light spectrum were chosen. The oracle device uses more ether to encode each color. 1 point of ether for 1 point of strength, then double that for 1 point of agility and so on. It seemed to me that in reality the stats were correlated with each other. Jake remembered, grumbling aloud. Like, you need bones strong enough to be strong without getting hurt or something like that. And they are. She confirmed. Hence the cost. Take the example of intelligence, which needs 16 times more energy than normal. In human beings, even at rest, the brain, which weighs less than 2% of body mass, consumes more than 20% of the energy produced. This is an evolutionary limit. A more powerful brain overheats and would become too expensive for the organism. In order to develop intelligence primarily with ether, it is encoded to strengthen certain aspects of the constitution, vitality, nervous system etc. The last reason this color code is so important is because the encoded ether is the main currency in the mirror universe where you will soon go as Earth is reassembled there.